Hello, and welcome to the Wallfacer Labs podcast. Today's guest is TJ Ragsdale, co-founder of Entheos Network and formerly of MakerDAO, where he worked on some of the earliest real-world asset deals. Tej, welcome to the show.
Thank you, sir. Pleasure to be here.
So maybe we'll get started with the classic bit of your background before crypto. I know you worked in traditional finance. I think you joined crypto from an investment perspective and then MakerDAO. Would love to hear about your background a bit, what got you into crypto, and maybe what that initial touch point was with crypto.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Yeah, so I was a suit for a while. I was really excited about it at the time. I graduated with finance and Chinese degrees, and everyone was going off to banking and consulting. I really thought I wanted to do that. But what I really wanted to do was play the game of finance rather than arranging risk, take the risk. So I found a position on the buy side at a hedge fund that was trading commercial mortgage-backed securities. So we took junior positions, highly risky positions in pools of commercial mortgages. And I thought that was fascinating. I learned from a great boss, really from the ground up, how to analyze individual assets and markets, which was awesome. COVID hit, and I was in investment committee one day. I looked across the table, and I had this weird sort of existential moment where I had the thought that if I stay where I am in 20, 30 years, I'm going to be these men across the table from me. And I wasn't thrilled about what I saw, frankly. So I quit rapidly after that. Early COVID, we all had too much time to think. I moved to Turkey for 3 months to sort of plot my next moves. And, at this point, I'd been investing on my own book in crypto for a while. But I didn't know where I would fit. And I was kind of intimidated by it all as, I don't have a software engineering background, I have a finance background. And I think like many of us coming into the space, you assume for whatever reason that if you don't have those backgrounds, you're not as valuable. But Maker came across my radar. Really, Sebastian, now with Steakhouse, was building the real world asset team there. And he, posted on Twitter about some job, and I was like, I've never seen people post on Twitter about jobs, but I guess I'm supposed to respond to this. So I responded and told him about my background, and I was one of the early hires on the MakerDAO team. Ended up, growing in that team and eventually leading that team to some pretty great deals. And since then, have left to found a startup in the energy space called Entheos. So I don't know. I don't actually remember the question, but hopefully I answered some of them.
Yeah, no, I think you got it. Just that initial thing into crypto. I guess even before MakerDAO, though, as you were a suit, as you said, where was the initial spark with crypto? Like maybe what was the first asset you invested in, or Bitcoin, something else that caught your eye initially?
Yeah, absolutely. It was Bitcoin. During COVID, I started to think a lot about what I deemed to be. It effectively seemed like the people in charge of the world's finance were drunk, and I thought I was a bit crazy, and that it was odd to me that no one else was noticing this, right? But in traditional finance, you realize that like all these people depend on that machine working, and it creates existential dread to question the very existence of that. But anyway, these are ideas I started to have, and I found this cohort of people that seemed to be having similar ideas, and in fact had way more conviction to the downside than I did. And so, I bought my first Bitcoins in 19, and then even more in 20 as the COVID stimmies went out. And then, I think the rest is a little bit of a trope, right? Realized there was more sort of expressive programmatic world in Ethereum, and went down the risk curve and saw that people are actually building applications on top of Ethereum that could do interesting things, which really led me to Maker, which was this tremendous origin story of basically saying most of the world can't access dollars because they're blocked from doing so. And so they're sort of locked into, the wasteful fiscal and monetary policies that their local government are forcing upon them. Maker comes along and they say, well, no, I mean, we can, basically take these digital permissionless assets as collateral and mint synthetic dollars against that, giving theoretically anyone on earth, people or businesses, access to synthetic dollars, which at the time, and apparently still, is the world's reserve currency. And I thought that was just absolutely mind-blowing, a parallel financial system. And so little did I know, a year or two later, I was at Maker.
Nice. Well, that is actually kind of a perfect stepping stone for what I wanted to talk about next, which is we're just past, I guess, the 1-year anniversary of a massive report that you and some other co-authors had wrote called the Unreal Primer of Real World Assets, I'd love to spend some time talking about that report and just kind of go back to the frame of mind that you were in then. So when you guys wrote that in October 2022, I think the Huntington Valley Bank deal at MakerDAO had just gone live as a big kind of flagship thing, uh, and real world assets felt like it was maybe getting its first real adoption. But I guess if you go back to when you wrote that report, what was it that you and the authors were looking to convey or get other people in the industry thinking about?
Yeah, so I think it was a combination of things. The first was I knew I wanted to move on from Maker, and I always have an insane amount of anxiety when I don't have a task or a project I'm working on. So I kind of just created that out of thin air to reduce my anxiety. At the same time, I did see what I thought was a need in the market to really formalize what I thought was a fairly mature industry that was utterly unnoticed and unreported on. And I think part of what was missing was in that report, we not only talked about where kind of the state of affairs now and how we expect things to evolve, but we created a sort of a taxonomy for who the players in the space were. Who's building infrastructure, who's building application, who's focusing on which geographies and assets. And I think that map, the concept of a landscape makes it all much realer for people. They realize all of a sudden that there is this, teeming industry of innovators that are all trying to bring the world's assets on chain. So I think like part of what's really important in crypto is, attention is so scarce that if you want people to pay attention to a thing, you have to simplify it and you have to magnify it. And so, we created as much buzz as we could. We tried to put together a framework that we wish we had. And I think hopefully, I think people took to it quite well, and it was interesting for some people. It created new conversations, but at the very least, it made the world realize that there are 100 protocols at the time, now, hopefully thousands, that are trying to do something other than recursive leverage and bullshit.
Interesting. Yeah, I have to imagine your position at Maker at the time definitely informed how you thought about that. Because, again, I think Maker has its own challenges of working with it from the outside, but definitely at that point, I think every RWA team was coming to Maker, trying to figure out how they could recreate some of the things like HVB and whatever else was going on then. So I guess with that kind of frame in mind, there were certainly a couple concepts from the report that stuck with me. One that stands out is the concept of birth and rebirth assets. That's probably my favorite and something I still find myself referencing regularly. Could you maybe break that down?
Yeah, that was, I thought a lot about how that dichotomy should be captured. Because again, I think, you can't spend too much time getting the concept perfect. Because it hopefully will capture a whole bunch of complexity and allow people to speak about all this exciting stuff that's being built kind of in a more intelligent way. But yeah, so this dichotomy or the dichotomy we kind of saw at the time is actually hopefully one that will disappear completely if we're successful. But the idea is, rebirth assets are traditional legacy TradFi assets that are effectively being re-ledgered or re-represented on chain. And the idea there is, these assets have existed for a long time. There's existing demand, there's existing markets, but can we re-ledger them onto new rails in a way that solves problems for asset issuers or the buy side? So you can think about that as, commercial real estate, where I cut my teeth, all this work in U.S. Treasuries, things of that nature. Assets that exist that are being re-represented. The other side is what I find far more exciting. Which is birth assets. These are assets that are new. They're net new. They live natively on chain from the start. The idea being that actually the very ownership, the deed, the title can live on chain from the start and be enforced in the on-chain consensus environment, as opposed to this disagreement that you have with rebirth assets, which is, well, a lot of these assets exist in a physical ledger in the real world. They're backed by violence, and no matter what your smart contracts say, if you need to foreclose on an asset, you need courts and lawyers and guns. So birth assets are new assets that we don't even know to consider yet. These are things potentially like parametric insurance. These are hash-powered derivatives. what we're building at Entheos, which is financializing smart battery assets, all the stuff that we don't know to expect. I mean, I think if you look back right at the internet, early on in kind of the innovation around the internet, the entrepreneurs were taking existing mediums, radio and magazine, and they're pasting them on the new rails, right? If we look back, now that we have 20 years of hindsight, the $1 trillion business models were not that. They're completely different ways of using the fundamental infrastructure to do new things, Facebook, YouTube, whatever. And I think the same logic will play out here for birth assets on chain, which is to say people will figure out ways to create assets that don't exist in the real world, and these will be $1 trillion industries. I mean, even if you look at something like DPIN, right, something like Helium or Akash, these are physical infrastructure networks that will require financial markets to help vendors and buyers navigate risk. I'm very, very excited about the prospect of completely native financial assets that do touch the real world, that do provide real people and real businesses resources.
Yeah, interesting point. And I think DPIN is a good category of example there. So I guess to kind of restate, so rebirth assets are things that already exist off chain, kind of being reledgered or brought onto a blockchain. Rebirth are these completely new types of assets. I know in the past, I think we've talked about things like, debt from DAOs and things like that, but DPIN definitely seems to have been the category that's taken off more in that kind of category. Overall, I feel like most of the attempts we see in RWA are rebirth, though. Any perspective on why that is? It's just the obvious kind of skeuomorphic thing to do, or
I think that's right. I mean, I think one of the hardest things we've had to deal with in the real world asset space on chain is adverse selection. Like, why, Mr. Borrower, are you here? And often the answer is, well, no one else would lend to me, right? And so I think when you look at sort of why most of the activity is skewed towards rebirth assets, it's, there are existing markets for these things. People understand them. Many of them are inherently low risk, or what we've long considered to be low risk. Treasuries being an interesting example at the moment of something that was sort of the fundamental building block and now seems to be going through some growing pains or late stage capitalism pains. But I think it's just easier for people, right? It's less of a educational lift to say, no, you should invest in, a futures contract that gives you rights to a certain amount of bytes of helium connectivity or whatever. It's much easier to say, we have some US treasuries, we're putting them on chain. A lot of the administrative overhead that came from managing that treasury ETF has now been squashed because we're using smart contracts and whatever. That's easy. Everyone wants that. It solves a problem for crypto native borrowers. I do think as we move on, that skew will shift, where there will be a natural and slow migration of rebirth assets on chain. I think someone like Chainlink is working to build the infrastructure for all this to allow the assets of the world to be re-represented and hopefully to create some efficiencies. But I think where the real growth comes from in sheer speed is from those birth assets. And I think we're at the very beginning of that. You mentioned briefly the debt for DAOs, DAO to DAO lending. I mean, we've talked about this quite a bit. I continue to believe that is an absolutely fascinating and pure use case of a birth asset. I mean, the idea of having 100% guarantee that if a DAO defaults on its obligations to another on-chain party, a smart contract could foreclose those native tokens. I mean, that is a credit investor's wet dream. And I think things will naturally move in that direction. If you're removing risk from the system, it means cost of capital goes down, which is ultimately why I think we're all here.
Yeah, that piece of recourse and just having all the assets live on chain is such an important one. And, I talk with a lot of teams that are, trying to do things in RWAs. And there definitely is this disconnect with non-crypto native folks looking at RWAs, where for crypto native people, this piece of the on-chain collateral is so important. And so regardless of how strong the off-chain legal aspect is, for crypto native people, that just doesn't compute when the alternative, you could have these on-chain assets that are sitting there.
Right.
And so it does feel like within the birth rebirth assets, that's the new paradigm, whatever you want to say, that I think for crypto native people at least is a very key aspect. And that off-chain legal is something that so many people I think just overlook when they're even comparing the risk of these different assets today.
Yeah, and I think that concern goes both ways, right? Just as sort of the folks that have not spent time in traditional finance that are super familiar with the depths of DeFi are like, really? There's legal recourse and courts and foreclosure and all this messiness in the real world. The other side is also true, where if you and I were having this conversation with someone at KKR, and we're like, well, you can just have fully deterministic debt markets on chain between borrowers and lenders. They're like, yeah, but what's my collateral? And you're like, well, it's the native token of the project. They're like, well, I don't want a token. And you're like, well, no, you actually might want a token because it's ultimately no different. Like, it can convey equity in certain jurisdictions, but that doesn't compute either. So I think it's just like, over time, those two worlds, I would describe them as two different consensus environments. I think they will merge, right? I think you saw that with the internet, with just services and goods going online. At first, people were like, I don't want a digital picture of a thing. I don't want a digital video. I want real stuff. Then it was like, well, no, there are certain like benefits and efficiencies from being on the internet. And once society comes around and recognize the internet as legitimate rails, activity moves in that direction because it's net better. I think we'll hopefully see the same thing.
Yeah, it's something, we can talk a little bit about T-bills, but it's something that I think is missing in the on-chain T-bill treasuries conversation today, where I haven't really seen someone do a detailed off-chain legal analysis of the different structures. I think RWA XYZ has one, but there's been a couple new products that have launched even since then. But that's really the thing, right? The on-chain component of these things are relatively similar. Either you're investing into a T-bill directly or an ETF, but on the off-chain side, are you investing into an SPV? Are you investing directly into a fund? Is it a loan? Something that I think gets lost in this RWA conversation sometimes.
Right.
So on that, one of the other concepts from the Unreal Primer was this idea of adoption happening through a pincer movement. My summary of that would be, you have high quality assets like treasuries doing this kind of top-down approach to bringing RWA on chain. Then you also have these more emerging asset classes, kind of bringing in investors or bringing in issuers from a bottoms-up perspective. Is that basically a correct summation of the pincer movement?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
Okay. It seems like today we've seen or at least at this exact moment in time, November 2023, we see a lot of that top-down interest happening, where there is a plethora of on-chain T-bills launching today. And it feels like that other piece, the more emerging credit, has kind of frozen up. What's your summary of kind of where we are today in that pincer movement of adoption?
Yeah, so I think, frankly, looking back, I think what has evolved since the primer in terms of kind of the low-risk T-bills infrastructure developing more than the emerging market, emerging asset infrastructure is more a function of macro than it is anything on the ground in terms of where builders are spending their time or where there's demand. So what I mean by that is, if you look at something like Maker, right? When I was doing RWAs at Maker, we had a pretty diverse book, for better or for worse. We had some low-risk liquid treasuries. We had some commercial real estate like HVB, yada, yada. If you look at the book today, Maker is one of the biggest crypto-native lenders to the U.S. government that there is. The other big ones being Circle and Tether. The reason for that, right, is you can lend to the U.S. government at an absurdly high rate. Right, so there is a huge carry trade to be had, and there's huge demand in getting those T-bills into an on-chain environment so that on-chain participants can access that spread and that yield. Similarly, I think as capital markets have eroded, whether you measure that by the risk-free rate or spreads, I think the money has simply dried up for high-risk emerging market credit. I don't think anyone really wants it in any case. So I think there you see a fundamental adverse selection issue where, we saw, for example, a goldfinch pool went belly up. I don't know how that went, but these things are inevitable, right? This is part of building. But I do think it's just really hard to get money right now. And so the fact that the pincer has not played out and that longer tail of assets hasn't really come on chain as much, I think needs more time to bear out in the data. But until macro gets better, whether you're talking about borrowing against esoteric African assets on chain or off chain, it's going to be tough.
Yeah, basically agree with all of that. And I think, for better or for worse, if you go back to 2022 when you wrote the report or in the time period before that, I guess echoing what we just said as well, I think most people just didn't always understand the risks of whether it was emerging market credit or whether it was what we were doing in TrueFi, what Maple was doing, lending to crypto trading firms. It's not that these were inherently bad in any way, shape, or form. And when you look at the default rates, I do think they are still, low single digits in most cases. It's just that it wasn't going to be no defaults forever. I mean, that's just not how credit works. And I think now you probably see a bit more, maybe too much hesitation in some sense, but maybe justified in others.
No, I mean, I think that's right. And something that frustrates me about, when I talk to especially older folks in traditional finance about the innovations that are happening on chain, people apply a certain cynicism to crypto that they don't apply to similarly risky other areas. So what that means is, like, we saw something like the defaults on Maple lending to crypto native lenders, or Goldfinch lending to emerging markets, and people are like, see, crypto doesn't work. And it's like, well, if you look at really any emerging lending marketplace, right, these are startups that need to prioritize growth in some capacity. So it's almost part of the roadmap. No one's going to say this explicitly, but it is. It's almost part of the roadmap that you sacrifice some losses for growth, and then you learn, right? And you develop a proprietary underwriting methodology and tools to ensure that stuff doesn't happen again. I mean, you see it across the factoring world too. Like the first 5 years of every trade finance or factoring lender are typically either really, really slow and there are no losses, or moderately fast and there are some losses. I think it's just part of the game, and it's nothing inherent about crypto that would suggest that defaults are any higher. What I will say is, back to our previous point, I think there is definitely a little bit of naivete among the RWA crowd around the realities and complexities of recovering, getting your money back in the real world. What does that look like? Everyone wants to talk about loan volumes. Everyone wants to talk about TVL. No one wants to talk about, did you get your money back, which is ultimately what makes a credit investor good.
Right. Yeah, and I think what you said there is correct, and was certainly something that we thought about at TrueFi, or at least I thought about, which was defaults were going to be expected across any platform. And I think today, the 4 platforms who have done the most loans are TrueFi, Maple, Goldfinch, and Centrifuge. Each of those platforms has had at least one default at this point, or pool kind of in a state of default at the moment. I think actually the important thing is that default happens after you've achieved enough scale or credibility, because I think too early in the process, it's just very, very tough to come back from. But each of us were at a place of maturity and perhaps more expected default when those respectively happened. Okay, so next concept from the report that I found very interesting is this idea of standards within the industry, within RWA. Right now, every platform is its own unique snowflake, different smart contracts, different structures, handle tranching in different ways. And I think one of the things you had talked about was that is kind of holding RWA adoption back broadly. Can you maybe expand upon that and where some unified standards would actually help improve adoption of the space?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you see this push and pull happen also in every technological frontier. What I mean by that is, early on, you see a whole bunch of competitors vying for resources and vying for dominance that want their standard to be the standard. If their standard is the standard, they accrue a lot of resources and significance and wealth. That's awesome. But typically what ends up happening is, because everyone's vying for position, it actually constrains the growth of the whole industry, because it means that there is less compatibility across platforms. In our case, there's less liquidity across platforms. If there's less secondary liquidity across platforms, it constrains the whole thing. I think secondary liquidity is ultimately the single biggest unlock for RWAs on chain. That's the promise. That's what we haven't gotten to yet. Even if you look at the internet, right, we ended up on TCP/IP, which was a really thin protocol that didn't have any take rate, that allowed for all of the value to accrue to the stuff on top of it. That was critical. But before that, right, there was the protocol wars. IBM wanted to be their standard. A whole bunch of others wanted to be their standard. So if we fast forward to today, to me, it's an inevitability that we will settle upon some sort of standards. There's a bunch of standards in that stack. Something like an ERC20 versus Solana SPL token is one. I think we'll sort of solve those through bridges. But frankly, that's kind of the easy part. I think we need standards for how assets are packaged. You think about sort of what does a yield-bearing asset on chain look like? I think something like an ERC 4626, which is like a sort of standard yield-bearing vault, standards like that could exist that mean that these assets behave, are custodied, and represent their yield in a similar way across platforms. That stuff is really very important. I don't think it'll happen quickly. But if you look at sort of financial markets, right, the idea of a QSIP, right, this is an identification number that allows you, it's a unique identification number for a security. Right? That was really, really important for all the financial innovation that was kind of built on top. So the entire securitization world, right, these fairly complex pools of assets that have certain rules about how the underlying yield gets distributed across investors, that is all captured in this common QSIP standard. I don't think we have the QSIP on chain yet, but I think ultimately what the RWA innovation is converging upon is a new standard for how finance is done. And again, there's a few components of that, whether it's the liquidity standard, the vault standard, the underwriting standard, the legal standard, custody standard. But that's where we're moving to. And as soon as that happens, it allows for a whole bunch of activity that actually solves problems for real world operators.
Yeah, so you mentioned that there's a couple layers to that standard where it could be specifically around the packaging of assets. Who or what protocol or entity or team is most primed to be the creator or enforcer of those standards? Is it a massive lender today like a Maker? Is it one of the protocols that's doing the origination, trying to get other protocols to adopt to it? Who comes up with that?
That's a good question. I don't have a great answer to it. Again, I think there's a few different pieces of that standard that comprise kind of a total standard for how assets are represented on chain. I do like the work that Chainlink is doing. I think, to me, what that is it's effectively a translator between off-chain consensus, off-chain assets, and on-chain consensus and on-chain assets. And I think until that infrastructure gets built out, you're always going to have a disconnect. I also do think that a group like Stakehouse, I think they've brought a level of rigor and professionalization to how we represent and understand risk and underwriting on chain. So I still think we have a bunch of work to do, which is basically we need to get people that really understand risk to be underwriting assets that live on chain. So I don't know if you'd describe that as a standard necessarily. It's not really a protocol. It's just a shift away from sort of ad hoc, naive underwriting to stuff that's more rigorous, that makes us all look better and invites participation of more legitimate parties. So I think those two levels, sort of the translation layer, call it an oracle, although that's a bit of a, I think it's a bit of a sort of a small term to describe what Chainlink is doing. It's really that interfacing layer between the real world and crypto, and then better underwriting standards that we hold everyone to. I think those two would be huge unlocks.
That is an interesting point. And I think again echoes the things we've said, which is the standards that I think you're outlining as being the most critical here are more again in these off-chain human components of the underwriting, the legal structuring, the financing, the things that, Maker Forum has got pages and pages and pages about just all of the different structures they've used to be able to invest in these assets. So that's certainly a big piece of it. I guess also there's this idea of the protocol wars that you talked about, in the internet, and just using my, crypto brain, I kind of thought a little bit more about the actual RWA kind of origination protocols fighting each other here, but maybe that's actually less, and they'll just conform to whatever it is that the underwriter, issuers are kind of going for, the lender, the capital, essentially.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I also think if you think about kind of the game theory between two of these, competing RWA marketplaces, let's say whatever, a Centrifuge and a TrueFi, I think what these groups will realize is the single biggest unlock for us to scale is figuring out the buy side, right? Everyone can get a supply of assets because everyone's always looking for money. But can you get people to buy those assets? We need to move towards a space where this dream of increased secondary liquidity on chain is actually real, right? Because I feel like it's sort of this, like it's like the Schrodinger's statement, which is like we're trying to convince the real world to come bring their assets on chain because there's secondary liquidity. But when you look at it, there's actually not sufficient standards for there to be compatibility across different platforms, and the secondary liquidity isn't there. And so I think you'll see two of these individual actors realizing that the game theory is actually, it suggests that they do build bridges across each other's platforms if that increases the secondary liquidity. I think this is this kind of log jam on the whole industry where people think it's in their best interest to keep, ironically, a gated garden, but it's actually critical that those standards come, secondary liquidity exists, so you can actually shuffle around and trade these assets, which would be a huge unlock, particularly for assets that aren't as liquid as, say, US Treasuries.
Right. And, in terms of the unlock for the buy side, I agree secondary liquidity is such a big one. That is definitely an area where there's no standardization today. I think, for example, most of these protocols spit out different LP assets, whether it's an NFT or an ERC20. And I know people have even used, modifications on the ERC20. So all different types of assets. That said, I think in the categories where we have seen some things with secondary liquidity, so Maple's original permissionless pools, TrueFi's original permissionless pools, Goldfinch's senior tranche, FIDO had, Curve Pool, for example. You don't see a lot of, even though they can have liquidity, which is like a separate legal thing in some sense, even though they do have liquidity, it's very limited. And you see so few transactions that go through these pools. So I don't know if that's just a demand and sort of interest piece or where that comes from, but it feels like another kind of challenge that we see.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. And I think over time that will naturally grow. But again, I think we're in this weird spot where, for the rebirth assets, like the problems being solved are not massive. And so the drive towards the TVL in those pools is also not massive. And I think on the other side, you have adverse selection with these kind of esoteric assets that ultimately no one wants. I think where the magic will come is new asset classes that TradFi does not have access to today. It literally does not exist, that we prove have been fundamentally de-risked in whatever way on chain. And it also makes it much easier for those assets to have secondary liquidity because you don't have a standards issue. You're not dealing with all this complexity in the real world necessarily. It makes it much easier to transfer those assets across different pools, lever them up, splice them, dice them, pool them, whatever.
Great point. So one of the other things I think you talked about in the report in terms of unlocks for the buy side is for RWA protocols to actually be able to show a meaningful decline in costs. And at least today, it's hard to pinpoint those things precisely, I think. And I think if you are someone looking at crypto for the first time, if you're one of these traditional institutions, the cost of getting set up in the first place can seem a bit intimidating. New custody solutions, MPC solutions, legal analysis, whatever it might be. Where are you seeing those areas for cost decline for traditional buy side coming into crypto and things that are or haven't materialized yet?
Yeah, so I think the huge cost efficiencies are still ahead. It is my opinion that it is the securitization world that will ultimately benefit the most. What I mean by that is, when I used to invest in these pools of mortgages, you would have 50 underlying loans. Once a month, rent would be collected on the underlying buildings. That rent would come into the servicer. The servicer would then hand it over to the trustee. The trustee would hand it over to the other servicer. And then the servicer would ultimately issue us a remittance report and our disbursements. Right? But if you look at the underlying math, It's just a set of rules, right? A set of rules that some human being reads, and then the cash comes in and they distribute that cash. And then the asset, sort of the reporting infrastructure is very much the same, right? Once a month, someone goes into all those buildings and collects a rent roll. And they check the rent roll and they pop it into PDF, maybe transcribe it to an Excel, and then send it to my desk 6 weeks later. So the entire securitization world, right, is really just a mathematical abstraction that requires humans to remit cash and report on performance data. There's no reason why all of that administrative overhead cannot be simplified into the auditing happens on a blockchain, right? A blockchain is built to be audited. The information is warehoused on a blockchain, and the cash is remitted immediately with no settlement or payment risk via smart contracts. If you look at the cost structures of securitization, Kevin Meow at Block Tower put out a good piece on Packy McCormick about this. The cost structures are absolutely enormous. You have enormous levels of intermediaries that are holding up the securitization system, which in turn supports a lot of the world's assets. So I think when you think about pooling assets and sort of distributing the cash flows to underlying bondholders, there's so much room. We're talking about 75 to 125 bips of inefficiencies that I think can be squashed to almost nothing. For me, before we get to the point where we are securitizing, really pooling assets on chain, I think the other parts of the cost structure are so small that they don't necessarily move the needle quite as much as we'd like to see to have a lasting change to really pull real assets on chain. But that's just my own take.
Yeah, very, very interesting points around the securitization, especially. And I agree. We haven't really seen that today. And I have to imagine, even for some of the giant deals that Maker has done with, say, for example, like Block Tower, I have to imagine a lot of their setup costs for getting like even that T-bill, Andromeda live. Yeah, I'd imagine a lot of the upfront there probably eats into what is generally some margin in general. I mean, credit is not always the most lucrative. So,
yeah, I think there's a kind of elephant in the room there, which I love to be the bringer of bad news in this way. I think it's a little bit of a fugazi when people look at Maker as an example of the clearest success in the RWA space. The Maker has a superpower, right? It can mint money. No one else has that. And so to your point, early on, everyone wanted to borrow from Maker for no other reason than because it's cheaper, right? So a lot of the RWA activity that Maker does is not, for all intents and purposes, in the money. It's in the money because Maker can mint DAI and they can lend at a spread. As long as that exists, of course, you can take advantage of that opportunity. But I think broadly, the success of Maker, because of that superpower, has very much clouded what is otherwise, not as much innovation as we might hope.
yeah, I think looking at, I guess, some of the non-U.S. Treasuries credit deals on Maker, those are definitely not priced to perfection. I think that would be an understatement in terms of what those people are able to borrow from Maker at. And I think if those things were priced to perfection, you do wonder if it still is worth the work and effort of getting set up there.
Right, exactly.
So, I think not priced to perfection is a kind way to say it. But yeah. Okay, interesting. So, yeah, that's a good question because I do think that today when people talk about RWA, Maker is obviously the number one thing people talk about. Frax also more recently has gotten involved. They have this new FinRes PBC and SFrax, which I think rebalances between U.S. Treasuries and some of their DeFi opportunities. People are talking about Canto, CANTO more recently as well. When you think about the maybe underrated or players within RWAs, who do you think about? Where do you, find interesting pockets of opportunity?
It's been a while since I've really looked into it. But again, for me, it's all about the birth assets. So I think stuff like parametric insurance is really interesting. It hinges on an Oracle problem. The idea here, if listeners aren't aware, is you can effectively mitigate one of the core risks of the insurance world, which is as payout risk ultimately, and disputes about whether the event in the contract actually occurred or not. So you could have, for example, crop insurance, say on, coffee in Ethiopia, and built into the smart contract, of course, are the conditions required to parametrically, or the parameters required to parametrically pay out that contract. And so there might be, 10 white labeled oracles, which maybe are rain meters distributed in the area being covered. If the rain meters do not detect sufficient rain in a certain period, then the parametric insurance would pay out to holders. A lot of the world does not have access to something like insurance. And when you don't have access to insurance, it makes it very difficult as a farmer, as a business operator, to actually expand your business because you can't mitigate that risk, which means you have to stockpile cash, right? So something like that to me is fairly interesting. And then again, all of the stuff in the DPIN world, I think it will be some time before we categorize that necessarily as real world assets, because these are consumable resources at the moment, right? It's like these are digital commodities of some sort. But I think the natural next step, just like you see in the physical commodities world, is this financialization and these risk contracts that allow people to share risk in a way that expands business activity. I think ultimately will be no different with decentralized compute, with video transcoding, with any of this stuff. And I'm really excited to see what people come up with there.
Nice. Well, that I think is almost a perfect transition into what you're working on today. But before that, maybe just to kind of round out, this recap of the Unreal Primer. Obviously, there's a lot of things still holding back RWAs today. We've touched on several of them. If you could wave a magic wand and change one thing about either how the industry thought about RWAs or how the protocols approached it, what would you have as the biggest change that could help adoption flourish? Could be some of the things we've talked about already.
That's a good question. I think a pretty big unlock would be, frankly, if we had a cohort of people that are really good underwriters that really believed in what was happening here. I think really early on in DeFi summer, crypto got very esoteric and very annoying very quickly, which is fine. It's the way things work. People were making a lot of money. But it became insular and it became intimidating to the outside world. And I think beyond it, the way people dealt with that intimidation was to write it off as sort of, a bunch of fools making digital money. And that really prevented a lot of people, I think, from entering what is and continues to be a really promising industry. And so I think if you can import a lot of legitimacy through human capital. So I think early on, if there were a bunch of folks that entered the space that really understood the pipes, that helped kind of professionalizing the underwriting infrastructure and standards, I think that would have been a complete step change for the industry. I think, frankly, that's what we're going through right now. I mean, if you look at the flows, a lot of the flows right now are institutional. And I think we have crossed the threshold where, it's been happening slowly for a while. We've crossed the threshold where really legitimate real-world business operators, underwriters, and investors are excited about the space. So I think we're kind of there. It's just taken quite a while, and I think part of that is because we may have early on alienated ourselves.
Yeah, and I think many events of the last year also feel like stepping on our own toes kind of thing, or I guess year and a half at this point. Terra, Three Arrows, obviously FTX, but it feels like we're mostly past, all of those dark clouds. So,
okay, and I think we are past those dark clouds. It's funny. Those are examples of crises that also I think the outside world applies unreasonable cynicism to. Every frontier always has opportunists, and that leads to shiesty behavior. And those opportunists ultimately they go down, and it's been no different here. right? It's the same thing over and over and over again. It's the same humans. Human behavior doesn't change. It's just a new technological frontier. So I do think now that that's out of the system, it does allow us to move forward. But again, I don't think crypto in that way is any different than any other technological revolution that literally has ever occurred.
Yeah, very true. Very true. Okay, so when you left MakerDAO about a year ago, you co-founded a company called Entheos Network. And I guess just for anyone listening, and for you as well, consider me a very much a neophyte on this next topic. I understand Entheos Network to be a company focused on energy storage solutions. Could you expand on both what Entheos is, specifically for folks like me who are not familiar with the energy sector?
Absolutely. So Entheos is really a two-stage rocket. So for stage one, we're very focused on battery technology. So batteries broadly, the premise here is we have a electrical grid that is very, very, very old. Demand for electricity will continue to rise as we electrify transportation and real estate. And whether you have fossil fuels or if nuclear magically arrives tomorrow, you have this massive transmission bottleneck. There are literally not enough pipes to get electricity to the humans and businesses that need it. So what that means is you need a degree of flexibility. You need to be able to store electricity closer to the endpoints that need them, both to provide stability to the grid and also to ensure that those endpoints have the electricity that they need at any given time. So you can think about this as batteries are useful because they move both the production and consumption of energy in time. So what we do is we build what we call an operating system for batteries. This allows us to monitor and control large-scale battery systems in a way that significantly reduces costs. It makes these batteries much more dynamic. They can read their surroundings. They can understand if there's an opportunity to sell electricity back into the grid. They can buy low, sell high, much more dynamic. So stage one of the business is really to build this sort of agnostic battery infrastructure that makes batteries cheaper and more efficient, which helps them scale. But the reason this sort of ties in directly to what I've worked on in the past is we see a longer term opportunity to financialize these assets, like many of the other assets that have been financialized, right? So I started in commercial real estate. You see similar securitization structures for auto loans, for credit cards, for all sorts of stuff, including solar. But batteries are in this weird spot where they're a young enough asset that A, they're not super efficient or super cheap, which is a hardware issue, a technology issue. And B, they remain expensive because there's not really capital markets that support them at scale yet. And so for us, what we'd like to do is be one of the first sort of infrastructure providers that allow for the large-scale securitization of smart battery assets.
Well, I think that comes very full circle with some of the other potentially crypto securitization benefits that we've seen. So this idea of an operating system for batteries, can you almost walk me through the flow of what energy production to the end consumer piece looks like and where this operating system fits in? Is it in the generation, transportation? Yeah, I guess what is encompassed within the operating system?
Absolutely. So, let's work with a practical customer scenario. Let's say you were running, a BTC mining rig in your house, right? Not super practical today, but let's just work with it. And you're drawing electricity from the grid. So what that means is whatever the market pricing is at any given time, you have no option but to pay for that market pricing. If you're in a grid that happens to have, for example, a lot of renewable power, that means that you have a lot of volatility in that grid, right? When the sun is out and shining, all of that solar is producing electricity at once. That drives prices to zero, and vice versa. When the sun goes down, prices are very high. And so what you basically want to do is you want to have a storage depot co-located with your load, which is your consumption of your BTC miner, that is smart enough to charge itself up when prices are zero, and then discharge to your local operations when prices are high, ensuring that you don't have to pull from the grid at that time. So what this provides for you is economic savings. And what it provides for the grid potentially is a reduction of congestion traveling across the pipes. But if you think about what's happening here, right? So you're working your BTC miner and you're charging AC, alternating current, from the grid. Batteries store electricity in DC, direct current. And so you have to there's an energy conversion process that happens there, right? On the way out, there may be another energy conversion process that happens. Maybe your BTC miners run on AC, or maybe you realize there's an opportunity to sell back to the grid, so you have to convert back to AC. So typically, wherever batteries are in the world, there is some energy conversion that has to happen, whether DC to AC, AC to DC, or changes in voltage. The problem there is there's a lot of loss and heat that is created on each and every one of those conversions, what we call a round trip. So what our system does is it eliminates a lot of the components that are necessary for that conversion. This is either called an inverter or a rectifier, which are expensive, they take a ton of space, and they create a lot of heat and loss. And our system effectively does those conversions natively, removing a lot of that cost and inefficiency from the process. So the operating principle here that we use, which is very different, is we control batteries at the level of the individual cell in the pack, the smallest possible subcomponent. So you can think about this as being a fully distributed battery management system that has tendrils in each and every cell, and we can really manipulate that battery to do exactly what the application demands at the lowest possible cost with the lowest possible loss.
Interesting. So to be able to do all of that, that's a software solution that you're able to apply to any kind of off-the-shelf battery technology that's out there, or for someone to take advantage of this, you're also producing the hardware component that they are putting in their home or business?
That's a good question. So yes, the system is agnostic. It really doesn't care very much about how big your battery is, what the form of the cells is, what the chemistry of the cells is. The actual technology itself is a combination of hardware and software. So as you can imagine, the software piece sort of informs how you're monitoring the cells, and then the sequence with which you're actually speaking to the cells and demanding electricity, right? That requires a certain algorithm that does learn on its own to ensure that that battery is being optimized and maximized. But as you can imagine, we're talking about energy here. And so a pure software solution is not going to be sufficient to actually coerce the cells to do what you want them to do. So there's a hardware component that sits on those cells, and provisioned upon that hardware component is the software that determines how the cells are interacted with and under what conditions. So what we provide is both the hardware component that sits on the cells, as well as the firmware that monitors and controls the cells.
Okay. So I might be jumping around a bit here, but in learning a bit about Entheos, I came across what was a very cool name, the Rebel Core Controller. Is that just sort of the name of this battery management system and the software operating system component here, or is that a related concept?
That's exactly it. That's the core technology. So that is the operating system. That is a controller that is monitoring and managing each and every one of the cells.
So I guess in terms of, I'm always interested in kind of the go-to-market of different companies, but in this case, do you try and go to businesses first that are looking for better energy solutions? Is it more of a consumer type of thing that you have in your home? How do you guys think about that?
It's a good question. So the energy world in terms of stakeholders is highly complex and variegated. So if you talk about the customer themselves, right, they'll typically be a integrator who manages the installation, commissioning, and maintenance of a battery for a customer, whether it's residential or commercial. That integrator often does not build the batteries. You often have an OEM, an original equipment manufacturer, who's actually building the systems. And then when you talk about the people that actually build the systems, they're often not manufacturing each and every component. So perhaps they would do cells and modules, So modules are the subcomponent one level higher than cells, but maybe they don't do these components that manage energy conversion. They don't do the battery management system. They don't do the energy management system. So you have a whole bunch of different layers. Very rarely is one company doing all of it. So for us, we're an infrastructure provider of battery management and energy conversion solutions for those OEMs. So rather than us going directly to the customer, if I approached you and I was like, Ryan, use this operating system for batteries, you wouldn't even know what to do with it. You're like, how, I don't have a battery. Can you get me a battery and can you install it? Or there's nothing you can do with it, right? It's not really a sensible go-to-market. So you have to go higher up in the value chain. So what we do is we license our technology to the guys that build the full systems, who then sell to the integrators, who then sell to you. So as an analogy, if you think about kind of the early PC days, right when we were making the shift from vacuum tubes to integrated circuits, there's a whole bunch of startups like Fairchild and others that were building integrated circuits, but they weren't selling to end consumers. The consumers don't know what to do with those circuits. The consumers want a computer. So every time the computer OEMs, HP, Dell, whoever else, sell a system with the integrated circuit inside of it, the company who built the integrated circuit would get paid a licensing fee, right? So it's a sort of passive but highly scalable and agnostic model. So every time a battery OEM builds a battery system with our technology embedded, we have a holographic sticker that sits on that system that indicates it's under our license. Every time they produce and sell a unit to a customer or an integrator, we get paid. So the idea there is, we are purely an infrastructure provider. We want to make OEMs as good at their business as possible. So we want their systems to be cheaper because our operating system eliminates these components. We want them to be more efficient and safer so they can sell more systems to customers. And the more they sell, the more money we make. So we're very much just a deep infrastructure level supporter of OEMs to be the best versions of themselves.
Interesting. Okay. So I guess that actually kind of raises up a point. So you outline this flow of people that are taking place here. So you've got yourself as kind of this deep infrastructure provider, you've got the OEMs, and then maybe a couple steps later, you've got an end consumer. And so to bring it back to that Fairchild computer example, right? The end consumer just wants a computer. In this case, the end consumer just wants cheaper electricity, I think would be or more prevalent electricity, wherever that might be. Something like that. Yeah.
That's exactly right. The consumer, and you got to remember, no one cares about electricity, right? It's not a consumer good that you buy on Amazon. People just want it to work and they want their bill to be cheap. So for the consumer, what I would say drives the consumer is two things. One is, how do I get my energy cost down as low as possible? There's a little bit of a related driver, which is, can I get cleaner energy, right? We'll see as time goes on, as capital markets fall apart, how much people prioritize green energy really. But it is a component, right? Especially for a lot of businesses that have a mandate. I would say the other thing that's frankly really important is a lot of these consumers have very sort of specific and constrained space requirements, right? So a lot of them are like, well, I want to put my battery indoors, but I want to minimize the footprint it takes because every square foot that I take for my battery is not something that I can, use for my business, my Bitcoin miners, my climate controlled warehouse, whatever. So if you can eliminate some of the footprint of these batteries, that can really make a huge difference in space constrained environments, which is another angle that we're taking.
And I guess to ask one more question about the flow of people here. As you guys are coming into the market, is there someone that you're replacing in this flow, or is this a just completely net new type of thing coming to the market?
Yeah, so we are standing in, you could call it replacing, really two parts of the value chain. So one is this component, which is a battery management system. You can think about it as the controller for batteries, how and when the battery is charged and discharged, as well as the energy conversion component, which manages those voltage transformations and the AC/DC. So we basically absorb both of those parts of the component stack into our system, which should squash costs notably.
Great. And I think my last question on Entheos is, I believe, but could totally be mistaken, that there is potentially down the road some crypto tie-in here, maybe in a very deep in kind of way. Um, yeah, where does that potentially sit in the future flow of Entheos?
Absolutely. So, for us, I was on a deep in panel yesterday. We're very different than your traditional kind of deep in protocol. What I mean by that is we don't intend to incentivize network activity with tokens. We view that as a potential business risk, especially because we sit in a very non-retail focused space. For us, our token, so to speak, is our core technology, right? That is the unlock that creates economics that we expect will drive consumer behavior. So we've been developing this thing for 5 years, this operating system for batteries. It creates great economics for customers. We expect that to move the market in the direction we want it to go. So for us, the token is not about something that you incentivize network activity with. For us, it's really once we have hyper efficient batteries at customer sites, how can we financialize them from the start the right way? And to me, what the right way looks like is creating securitization infrastructure that lives on chain from the start. To go a level deeper, right? A part of DeepIn that really excites me that I don't think is talked about that much is the convergence of, or really the proliferation of IoT, right? Real-time telemetry on the performance of the assets that you've invested in. Think about real estate, right? It's all this super human-driven, slow, low-fidelity process. Why are we not using sensors and equipment to provide real-time data on the performance of our assets? Insurance has started to do this. So if you pivot back to battery land, right, all of these batteries out in the world have Entheos technology running on them, right? Entheos technology is monitoring and controlling these batteries, but it's also creating a really rich data set of how the batteries are performing, which markets they're selling into, and the savings being generated for their customers. If you combine those two things, what we'd like to do is launch pools of Entheos-enabled assets. With those pools, pulling real-time telemetry data from the batteries that are selling into the grid or running savings for customers. We would like those pools, those securitizations, to be completely on-chain, not just in terms of the asset performance reporting, but also the flows of capital. So cash comes in from the underlying customers who are financing their batteries. That cash comes into a smart contract. That smart contract knows exactly how much cash needs to go to which investor in the waterfall at any given time, right? So you've reduced your settlement risk. You've reduced your payment risk. It is all on chain. It's all trackable. That, to me, is kind of the future of securitization. And that's what we're trying to build here.
What I think is so keen about that answer is that it feels like a lot of the lessons that come from the Unreal RWA report, plus some of your stuff at MakerDAO, certainly seems to have informed how you all are thinking about approaching crypto from Entheos as well. The piece of securitization, a lot of the cost benefit coming from payouts and decreasing settlement risk, so on and so forth. So it's, I don't know how much of that is a happy accident versus very intentional, but definitely seems like that's come full circle in your thinking and actions there.
I don't know how you look back upon the different steps in your career, but what I've always noticed is when I make my next professional move, it doesn't quite feel logical or like it has a flow. But looking back, I think you're absolutely right that there is just this, in hindsight, there's this very logical continuity between the steps we make and the decisions we make. So absolutely. I think it all has sort of fallen into place, whether you look back at kind of the days in CMBS or the days in Maker and now in Entheos. Hopefully we can tie it all together in a way that solves economic problems for customers.
Nice. Well, on that note, what should we expect from Entheos in the coming months and years? I mean, it doesn't sound like most people will have a way to interact day to day, but at the very least, we want to learn more. What should people be on the lookout for?
Yeah, so a lot of our work today is very B2B focused, right? We're working with really big old industrial players, which is exciting because there's a lot of disruption to be had, but also means that kind of the world of retail focused crypto on chain, those two worlds don't necessarily communicate with each other a ton. So on our end, we're very focused, purely focused on licensing our technology to big OEMs. So from time to time, you will see announcements and videos of the various systems that we've set up in the world. Most recently, we just installed a system in the largest food distributor in Norway's port microgrid. And it's actually providing supercharging support for uh, the world's first autonomous barge. So in Norway, you have pretty crazy geography where oftentimes goods need to get from one fjord to another or one coast to another. And it actually doesn't make economic sense to do it by truck because you're taking this big U loop. And so you want boats. And so these food distributors with endless warehouses all throughout Norway, they really want boats going back and forth between two terminals all day. So this group, Norgesgruppen, really their subsidiary ASCO, has purchased autonomous ferries which just shuttle goods back and forth each and every day. As you can imagine, the time that those ferries spend at port is money lost. And so often in these fairly rural locations on the coast of Norway, there's not enough electricity transmission to supercharge those ferries. So our system sits in there. It's using completely secondhand cells from Hyundai, and it's helping supercharge these ferries. And so there's going to be a whole bunch of more announcements like that. And in parallel, we're also exploring really early ways to start pooling some battery assets and bring that stuff on chain. So I think that all that stuff happens in due time. Eventually, as we sort of think about how regular people can kind of interact with the protocol, what we really want to build eventually is a model that really allows as many groups as possible to launch battery projects throughout the world. Obviously, given that value chain we've discussed already, it's a complex world, right? It's not like launching a helium miner. Batteries are, not for your average everyday Joe to install. You have all sorts of risks. But eventually, we do want to create a sort of workflow and a platform that allows for the different parties necessary to drive a successful battery project, to find a project, to put the pieces together, and to get paid for that work. So eventually, if we're successful, you'll have some capacity as a local operator who sees a market opportunity to deploy a battery to actually to monetize that knowledge.
Nice. Well, we will be on the lookout for that. So perhaps to wrap up today, for anyone who follows you on Twitter, it's very clear that fitness, health, lifestyle, very critical to you. If you had to define the TJ Ragsdale health optimization function, what is it?
Yeah, so I would say for me, my philosophy is really rooted in two places. One is what I would call kind of a reversion to the way we used to live. I think, obviously current civilization is fantastic. Our quality of life is great. Safety is awesome. We have enough food, all this great stuff that I wouldn't possibly unwind. But I think a lot of the complexity that people face in taking care of themselves is actually due to those excesses. And so a really neat rule that I like to use is, does your behavior represent the way that humans have lived and thrived for hundreds of thousands of years? So for example, if you're eating an insane amount of processed foods and carbs, does that represent like a Paleolithic or hunter-gatherer diet? Probably not. You're here today because your ancestors thrived in their conditions. So to the extent you can, default to those conditions and your body will respond fairly well. High levels of activity, be out in the sun, be socializing, eat enough protein, don't eat excess processed foods, etc. The other thing I would say is, and I'm really very much focused on the minimal level of exertion necessary to get the maximum output health-wise. So, people that go to the gym for 90 minutes and are on their phone, like that's not the way to do it, right? Get there, 25 minutes, all out, leave. In terms of food, Super basic. Cooking doesn't have to take 45 minutes, right? Get some eggs, get some meat, get some cruciferous vegetables, pop it in a pan. In 10 minutes, you've eaten. The stuff is actually very simple. I think there's a whole bunch of operators in the fitness and health industry that actually benefit from making it more complex and making you think you need all these supplements, you need all these crazy routines, but actually think it is fairly basic. And when people realize it's fairly basic, the willpower required to carry out, I think, a good health and fitness regimen is actually much lower than people expect. So I would say it's those two things: kind of default to a hunter-gatherer type lifestyle, and then use a power law to ensure that you're doing the minimal possible effort for the maximum possible outcome.
Great advice for, almost every aspect of life. I think I've found mostly the same on the fitness piece, which is there is almost no reason why you can't just do 100 push-ups, have a door frame pull-up bar, just have the minimal type of thing in your home so that it's almost impossible to avoid fitness of some kind on the
Well,
fitness side. Yeah.
that's another good point, which is, I think there's this illusion that highly effective people, a cohort I won't include myself in, are have elite willpower, right? They're like, oh, these people have discipline that I could never have. It's like, well, actually, if you look at those people, they're actually just really good architects of their environment, right? So you talk about the pull-up bar on the door. You're trying to tell me you walk by that pull-up bar and you're not doing pull-ups every time you go by? Absolutely not. It's there, right? It's cognitively easy to engage with that. Your gym should be as close as possible, right? You should live in an environment where it's easy to be outside. You should lower the barriers to entry for good behaviors and erect enormous walls for bad ones. You shouldn't have cookies around. You shouldn't have garbage around the house, because if it's there, you're going to eat it. It's not about you not having willpower. It's just like, realize the power your environment has upon you and take the steps to architect it in such a way that you make the right decisions.
It's one of the things I am extremely anal about, which is whenever I'm choosing a place to live, it has to be less than a 10-minute walk to a gym. Otherwise, I know that I'm just not going to go as many times a week as I want to.
100%.
That bar has to be lowered. And food in the house is the easiest thing. Just absolutely never, ever, ever can have sweets in the house because I have zero self-control. It's just I have to set the environment so that self-control doesn't even cross my mind.
Yeah, I mean, especially as an entrepreneur, right? Like your schedule is not fixed. All sorts of stuff comes up. And so if what you thought was a 90-minute slot to get your exercise done turns into a 40-minute slot and your trip to the gym is 20 minutes, it's just not happening.
Yeah. Yeah, the plan that I use right now is from, I always forget the guy's name, but it's basically a minimalist 4-day-a-week workout, in and out as fast as humanly possible. You can swap a couple different things out. Great plan. But I guess the question, the point you made there about minimal amount of exertion for maximal amount of output, how does that apply to your work life, I guess, right? Does that exist for entrepreneurship? And, is there some trade-off there where you do still have to put in like the maximal amount of exertion to still get the maximum output?
Yeah. So, your own advice is the hardest to follow. It is much easier for me to apply these things to physical health than it is to work, but I think the principles are equally as powerful. I think there's like a fetishism in entrepreneurship about like grinding all day, right? Like get up in the morning, get behind your computer, do work until you go to sleep. That's what it takes to win. But I think the power law is right here too, right? Like ultimately, any of us, I think we only have 4 to 5 hours of really high output work. So, I think about work now, and I'm not completely there, but we're getting there, as sprints rather than a marathon, right? So block time, that time, a 3-hour slot should be sectioned for your hardest work of the day. You should focus on that slot, get that done. And then there should be a portion of time that's used for lower level administrative work. I don't think you should try to work from 7 to 7 because it's just not how the brain works. And so I think the same exact thing applies to work. I think there's another level to work, which is, or another sort of dimension to the power law, which is you gotta realize what you're great at and what you're not so great at. And in work, the people that are good at certain activities should disproportionately be specializing in those activities, right? So for me, I've never been really good at being deep in the details. It's not what I'm interested in. It's not what I'm good at. I work with people, for example, Christian Peterson, who worked with me at Maker, who's just like an absolute calculating machine, right? For me, what I'm good at is the bigger picture stuff, motivating people, selling, talking about what we're building, exciting people. I think I'm pretty decent at looking ahead to where things are going. So even in that, right, like realize that you're not so good at certain things and allocate less time to those things. Find the people that are excellent at that and put those people in their power. So I think it absolutely applies. For whatever reason, it's been so much harder for me to apply it to work than it is to fitness, diet, whatever.
Yeah, as one of my earliest bosses had said to me, do as I say, not as I do. I think there is a truth there. And as actually another one of my earlier bosses had given me the feedback very early in my career, I was in this role where I was kind of doing a bunch of things, and like the things I was very good at and the things I was just mediocre at, but I didn't want to give any of them up.
Right.
And, his feedback was so keen, which is, you can get even better at those things that you're pretty good at now. And if you just drop these other things that you're not great at and allow yourself to focus. Yeah. And then on the, 3 to 5 hours a day of having that best type of work, I definitely wish I was this, like what you read about, like a John Carmack, someone that can just work for, endless hours and is just 100x type of person. But I also find myself like, 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. is definitely the time where I can get the most productive, interesting, thoughtful work done. And then after that's kind of a crapshoot most times. So.
Definitely. I mean, that's how my day goes as well. Maybe genetically, I feel most powerful cognitively in the morning.
100%.
Like when I look at my day, frankly, like the exercise piece is the easiest part of the day. Like it's almost like it's so routine and delivers such a positive outcome, a rush of endorphins, feeling of satisfaction, reduction of stress, that it just happens each and every day. I don't have to worry about it. It's the other areas that require more discipline. So really, really hard work has to happen in the morning. And slowly over the course of the day, my brain sort of just erodes. And so what I find is like the afternoon is for admin, and then night is rather than any sort of production of work, it's often consumption of work. So I'm listening to stuff, I'm reading stuff, I'm talking to people. Those things are all much easier for my brain when it's more tired. So I think, it's all about just really understanding your strengths, how your brain works, how your body works, and then slicing and dicing your time accordingly.
Yeah, that end of the night piece is interesting. There's a tweet of yours I vaguely remember from a long time ago, because I think I responded to it about, we're always just ingesting these days some type of content, right? I mean, if I'm cooking, I'm probably listening to a podcast. If I'm walking, I'm probably listening to a podcast, whatever it is. And it's this, your brain is actually not taking any of this time to just process things. It's just always in this consumption mode. Do you still find that you give yourself time for that processing and just free thinking, or are you also in the constant deluge these days?
Yeah. So pretty much every day I'll take a walk, often after dinner. It is a constant battle to not consume on that walk. But I do find if I don't, I almost always benefit from it. If I don't let my mind wander on that nightly walk, the mind will find a time to wander, and it may not be a time that you like very much. So what that often means for me is when I'm trying to go to sleep. And if I don't sleep, then the whole system just gets screwed up. So yeah, I think that's also a super powerful thing, which is, this idea that we need to be consuming at all times to stay ahead. I think ultimately everyone or most people are consuming at all times. And so it's kind of an arms race. I think where your alpha actually lies is like in genuine thinking and connecting as opposed to collecting dots.
Absolutely. I've started doing my, kind of Lindy walks pre-dinner. And what I find is that anytime I'm not listening to things, I am just constantly recording voice notes on my phone, because like my brain is just shooting all of these things out where it's like, you needed to think about this and you just haven't given yourself any time. And, I find that I come back with those, with more ideas when I'm kind of doing it in silence. So certainly.
Definitely. We're gonna have to do a Lindy walk one of these days.
Please, when you find yourself in Mexico City, let me know.
Certainly will.
All right, sir. Well, thank you very much for all your time today. Really enjoyed this. Hope people listening, have more informed thinking about RWAs. understand a bit more about Entheos, and also have some things to apply to their day-to-day health, lifestyle, and fitness. So thanks for being on the show.
Of course, man. I feel like we covered a whole lot of range. So that's fantastic. My favorite sorts of podcasts. It's when people bucket the podcast into two tight topics, I feel like it's far less interesting. So it was fun, man. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. I'm glad that we let this one go all over the place.